So I've been playing back in 1995. Back in 1995 is a game made by a single man, a man named Takaki Ichijo, as an attempt to bring back ye olden survival horror, mainly Silent Hill. And as such, it stars an everyday everyman with a face made of porridge and a hairline that is literally transparent. His name is Kent, and he's one of those fuckers that falls in love with giant objects and/or buildings. In his case, it's this tower on yonder horizon that totes gets his boat flowing. And so, he's off on an epic adventure that involves monsters taking over the city and lots of locked doors. So yeah, if you haven't noticed, somehow, this game has a low poly, low texture art style reminiscent of good old Silent Hill. Though it looks more like a DS game than anything the PS1 would have shat out when compared to shit like Flower, Sun and Rain or the Nameless game. I do really dig it though. It's quite atmospheric in the same way that some Half-Life mods are, with the really odd-looking bloomless lighting and gritty textures. Only the textures here look quite a fuck of a whole lot more grittier. Being inspired by Silent Hill though, it has a lot to live up to. And while I do think it brings its own visual flair, the audio department leaves a lot to be desired. I mean, there is very little music, and while I do like what's there, especially the menu sounds are savage as fuck, the general lack of audio, especially voice acting, leaves the game feeling a bit leaves the game feeling a bit empty. It's just not quite as immersive as Silent Hill was, or even Resident Evil for that matter. Like the thickness of the fog, the rather warm yet cold color palette of the streets and buildings, and the soothing and monstrously well-composed music are all elements that make the first Silent Hill, even today, a very playable experience if you ask me. Sure, Harry looks like a mutant freak and the voice acting and writing aren't amazing, but at least it had voice acting and writing. And all of the thicky thickness I just talked about does a whole lot to cover up its technical shortcomings. But this game doesn't have any voice acting, as all quote-unquote cutscenes involve Kent walking up to someone, a camera panning, and this DS game-ass visual novel-looking screen popping up. Seriously, this font is straight out of the Nashino game. Add to that the fact that it doesn't have any thickness to hide its thinness, other than this shitty CRT filter that legit hurt my eyes, and you end up with something that just kind of misses that which made its inspirations work so very, very well. And even if it did have that, for some reason still, whichever technique that was used to simulate texture warping is just a little bit off. Sometimes textures warp so much, it almost looks like the floors and walls are getting sucked into a vortex or something. Probably not intentional, but considering the type of game this is, it almost kind of works sort of. I mean, it nearly gave me motion sickness here and there, so I'm gonna say that it's kind of a good thing in its own weird little way. But what's definitely not good though are the fucking monster designs. If there's one thing Silent Hill is known for, it's its iconic enemies. The nurses, Pyramid Head, these little baby looking things or whatever the fuck these are all quite famous designs. But this is literally a piece of shit. All in all though, it is made by a one-man guy and was intended to invoke memories of weird experimental Japanese PS1 games. So I will say that it at least nails that aspect relatively well as far as just the graphics go. Now of course, this is a survival horror game of the traditional variety. So you walk around using tank controls, flail your arms around at monsters and solve the odd puzzle here and there. Only difference is that this game is ridiculously easy. You see, the monsters you fight here don't pose a challenge even in the slightest, which isn't all that bad on its own, but considering what it's trying to emulate, it just doesn't really fit. I mean, Silent Hill, the first one in particular, can be quite the mean little cunt. The enemies will straight up gank you into a corner, puzzles are cryptic, twisted, and intelligently put together, and overall it's just a pretty hard game. But back in 1995, all enemies get stun-locked very easily, so there isn't anything stopping you from just spamming them till they're dead, and the swing range is pretty huge too, so you'll be likely to hit multiple targets as well, especially with the AI being programmed in a way that makes the poo monsters slide towards you in a straight conga line. And while I do commend the fact that the combat was made as awkward as possible, I mean, look at this swing. It's not at all contextually satisfying to do, and perhaps more importantly, it makes the game unscary. Like, check out this scene for instance. Uncut.
Like my dick.
Yeah, that's the closest thing the entire game has to a boss fight. This music can pretend something intense was happening all at once, but when your enemies die this easily, any false semblance of threat is just shat on completely. And that threat is a pretty integral part of the survival horror experience along with the survival bit, which is also completely absent. Now, the puzzles,
Oh dear God, the fucking puzzles.
all seem to rely more on remembering codes you find in notes than putting pendants into holes. There is like one puzzle where they make you stick a crank in something, but other than that, it's nothing but padlocks. Padlocks, padlocks, padlocks. And honestly, that wouldn't even be all that horrible if the means of getting there was fun and eventful. I mean, I mentioned Flower, Sun and Rain when talking about the graphics, and that's literally a game where you do nothing other than figuring out passcodes. But one passcode involves you learning about football history, and the other has you spending a day with luchadors and so on. But here, all you do is just pick up notes that are scattered about the place willy-nilly. They do kinda highlight some backstory as well, I guess, but they're not really written all that well, nor is the story given too much time as the game lacks proper cutscenes or even just characters in general. But anyway, you don't solve anything. It's more so just a case of you finding the note that outright tells you what to do. I did actually get stuck once, believe it or not, but that was because I overlooked a piece of paper that was camouflaged in an office space and not because I didn't get it. And where this already isn't all that fun of a design aspect to begin with, the log that's supposed to remember the notes for you suffers from short-term memory loss as it only shows the very last note you looked at. So, if you're trying to hold on to a long number like say an employee ID, and you just so happen to look at a painting of a cat, your log will contain nothing but pussy facts from here on out. Pretty fucking shitty considering how slow the walking speed is, and how basic and or boring the puzzles are in general. And that's also the thing. While I touched upon this before when talking about the combat, I still feel that it's worth noting just how odd the game feel is overall. And I'm not talking about the tank controls or whatever, they're fine.
Though the turning arc could have been a bit quicker.
But no, what I'm referring to is shit like the prompt to open a door not appearing when you're right in front of it because you need to take 2 fucking steps back. Or how about the camera angles being placed with seemingly little to no thought? And don't get me wrong, I fucking love pre-rendered backgrounds and cinematic angles, especially in horror games. But by the time the camera starts cutting into your face or completely obfuscating entire hallways, I think we may just be overdoing it a little. It's not even utilized in the same clever way as Silent Hill did, where it had meaning or a purpose, like highlighting an item, simulating anxiety, or hiding an enemy to make scary happen. It's just, again, placed with little to no thought. Shit just kind of floats around, clipping into things, serving only to confuse rather than to add. And hell, even if it was there just to fuck with you, it could have maybe spiced up the combat a little, but it doesn't do that either. Just when it actually could have done a thing, it's static and distant. And when you're just trying to go from point A to point B, it parks itself in Kent's cranium. I almost kinda love this game, but only for what it tries to be, for what it stands for, and for the wave of low-poly indies that don't look like fucking Star Fox with saturated bloom that I hope that this might trigger. But I don't like it for what it is, because what it is ain't very great. After the novelty wore off, which was after the first 30 minutes, I realized that I was not having fun. The combat isn't challenging, the puzzles are too simple and or pixel hunty, and the story and characters aren't there either. It feels more like a tech demo for this cool art style thing, which would also explain why it's only about an hour and a half long. Though I am still very fucking hesitant to call it bad outright. I mean, it has some meta-narrative like stuff going on, which does make me want to recommend it to people that are nostalgic for experimental PS1 games. And I do sincerely mean that, as it actually struck a chord kind of, but only because of the fact that I remember weird shit like Guys, Tomba, and of course the OG Silent Hill fondly. To everyone else though, don't bother with it. Its meaning won't mean shit to you, and it'll just be a boring, ugly piece of shit. And even then, there are actually better games even for that very specific niche, with things like Night Cry, Spooky House of Jump Scares, Power Drill Massacre, and Dead End Road. In fact, I might even do a video on that very subject sometime soon. And by sometime soon, I mean that I've only just started writing, so it'll be weeks from now, but still. So yeah, have a nice day. Goodbye. Mwah.